On a cloud-covered night over Japan in early 1945, a Japanese air defense radio operator stared at his own equipment in confusion, listening to reports coming in from observation posts along the coast that American B-29 bombers were approaching in tight, coordinated formations, flying directly toward specific industrial targets through weather that should have made any kind of precise navigation, let alone precision targeting, essentially impossible. There was no moon that night. Heavy cloud cover blanketed the target cities below, the kind of weather Japanese air defense doctrine had always assumed would force American bombers to either turn back or scatter their bombs randomly across the countryside, with no real ability to find and strike specific objectives. Instead, the bombers arrived exactly on schedule, exactly on target, as if the pilots could somehow see straight through the clouds to the cities and rivers and coastlines below. This is the story of how they actually did, in a sense, see through those clouds, using a piece of technology that Japanese air defense never fully understood and never developed an effective answer to for the remainder of the war. Here is the question worth carrying through this story. If you cannot see your target, cannot see the ground, cannot even see the horizon, how do you still manage to drop a bomb within a few hundred yards of exactly where you intended to hit? It is worth remembering just how novel and unproven the entire concept of blind, instrument-guided bombing still was at this stage of aviation history, barely a decade removed from an era when radio navigation itself remained an emerging and imperfect science, and radar as a practical military technology had only existed in any deployable form for a few years before American planners began asking crews to rely on it for missions of this scale and strategic consequence. The willingness to commit an entire strategic bombing campaign's operational tempo to a technology this young reflected both genuine confidence in the engineering behind it and the sheer operational necessity created by Japan's persistently poor bombing weather, a calculated wartime gamble on emerging technology that, unlike some other ambitious wartime technical programs, paid off with a reliability that exceeded what many of its own early skeptics within the American military had initially expected. American strategic bombing doctrine, as it had been developed and practiced through the early years of the war, rested heavily on the assumption that bombardiers needed a direct visual sighting of their target through the Norden bomb sight to achieve anything resembling precision, a doctrine built around clear daylight conditions and relatively unobstructed views of the ground below. This assumption held up reasonably well over parts of Europe during clearer weather windows, but it created an enormous operational vulnerability whenever cloud cover, smoke, or darkness obscured the target, conditions that, over Japan specifically, occurred with a frequency that threatened to make sustained, effective bombing campaigns against Japanese industrial cities almost impossible to conduct reliably. The solution to this problem had actually originated in British research developed to solve an almost identical problem faced by Royal Air Force bomber crews attempting to strike German industrial targets through the notoriously poor and unpredictable weather of continental Europe. British scientists had developed a ground-mapping radar system, capable of generating a rough but genuinely useful image of the terrain below an aircraft by bouncing radar pulses off the ground and displaying the returning signal as a pattern on a cathode ray screen, distinguishing between the different radar reflectivity of water, open countryside, and dense urban development well enough that a trained operator could identify coastlines, rivers, and city outlines even through complete cloud cover or total darkness. British scientists had made the underlying breakthrough that made this entire technology possible, the cavity magnetron, a compact device capable of generating high-power microwave radio signals at wavelengths short enough to produce genuinely useful ground mapping resolution, a piece of technology significant enough that its transfer to American researchers, alongside the broader package of British radar and scientific research shared through wartime cooperation, has been described by historians of military technology as one of the most consequential single pieces of scientific exchange of the entire war. American industrial capacity, once granted access to this British breakthrough, proved able to scale production of the resulting radar systems to a degree Britain's more constrained wartime manufacturing base alone could not have matched. Another example of the specific combination of British scientific innovation and American industrial capacity that shaped so much of the Allied technological advantage across multiple theaters of the war. American engineers adapted this British radar technology, along with parallel American radar research already underway, into a system designated the AN/APQ-13, more commonly known by its informal designation H-2X, specifically modified and integrated for installation aboard the B-29 Superfortress bombers flying the strategic campaign against Japan. The system worked by sweeping a radar beam across the terrain below and ahead of the aircraft, displaying the returning signal on a specialized radar scope, monitored by a crew member specifically trained in the demanding skill of interpreting these often ambiguous, low-resolution returns and translating them into an accurate picture of exactly where the aircraft was located, relative to its intended target. Selection for radar operator training itself involved evaluating candidates for a specific combination of aptitudes not always associated with conventional aircrew selection criteria of the period, favoring men who demonstrated strong spatial reasoning ability and a capacity to maintain calm, methodical judgment while interpreting ambiguous visual information under time pressure, qualities that did not always correlate neatly with the flying skill or aggressive combat temperament that selection processes for pilot or gunner positions more typically emphasized. Training a competent radar operator took months of dedicated instruction, beginning with extensive classroom study of how different terrain features reflected radar signals differently, followed by extended practice flights over familiar American terrain where trainees could compare the radar image on their scope directly against the actual landscape passing beneath the aircraft, building the specific pattern recognition intuition that no textbook alone could teach. This training pipeline had to be established essentially from scratch, specifically to support the B-29 campaign, since the scale and precision demanded of radar-guided bombing against Japan exceeded what earlier, more limited applications of ground-mapping radar in other theaters had required of the relatively small number of operators trained on the technology up to that point. This was, in practice, an extraordinarily difficult skill to master. Unlike a clear visual image through a bomb sight, radar returns displayed as a scattered, often blurry pattern of brighter and darker regions, corresponding to how strongly different terrain features reflected the radar signal. Water appearing dark against the brighter returns from land, dense urban development creating a distinctive bright cluster, distinguishable from open countryside, but requiring genuine skill and extensive training to read accurately and quickly enough to guide precision bomb release under the time pressure of an actual combat mission. Radar operators had to memorize the specific radar signature of each target city's coastline, rivers, and major urban features well enough to recognize them instantly on a screen that gave them only seconds to confirm their position before the critical bomb release point arrived. The radar system's usefulness extended beyond simply enabling bombing runs through bad weather, formation, navigation, keeping large groups of B-29s coordinated and correctly positioned relative to one another across the long overwater flights between the Marianas bases and the Japanese home islands, also depended heavily on radar, since visual formation keeping became impossible under exactly the same weather and darkness conditions that made visual bombing impossible. This meant radar technology was, in a very real sense, load-bearing for nearly every dimension of the night bombing campaign, not merely the final bomb release calculation, but the entire extended mission profile, from takeoff through navigation, formation assembly, target approach, and the long return flight back across open ocean to base. Stop and think about what this actually meant operationally, because the tactical implications reshaped the entire strategic bombing campaign against Japan in ways that went well beyond simply allowing missions to continue in bad weather. General Curtis LeMay's decision to shift American bombing tactics toward low-altitude, nighttime incendiary raids, a decision that produced some of the most devastating single bombing missions of the entire war, depended directly on radar-guided navigation and targeting capability, since night missions by definition eliminated any possibility of visual target identification through a conventional bomb site. Without functioning ground-mapping radar and crews trained to interpret it accurately, the entire tactical shift to night bombing that defined the war's final and most destructive air campaign against Japan would simply not have been operationally possible at the scale and precision it actually achieved. It is worth being direct about the accuracy limitations of this system, because radar-guided bombing, however revolutionary compared to the alternative of no bombing at all under poor conditions, never achieved the theoretical precision of a clear-weather visual bombing run using the Norden bomb site under ideal circumstances. Radar returns could be genuinely ambiguous, particularly over terrain with complex or unfamiliar coastal geography, and skilled operators sometimes misidentified specific target features under the pressure of an actual combat approach, producing bombing accuracy that, while dramatically better than no targeting capability at all, still fell measurably short of what a textbook visual daylight mission could theoretically achieve. LeMay's planners understood and accepted this trade-off explicitly, judging that the ability to strike at all through weather and darkness, even with somewhat reduced precision, represented a greater overall strategic value than restricting missions to the comparatively rare windows of genuinely clear weather over Japan. The radar operators themselves, formally designated as part of each B-29's crew, alongside the pilot, bombardier, and navigator, occupied a role that received far less public recognition during and after the war than the more visible positions of pilot or bombardier, despite the fact that on night and poor weather missions specifically, the radar operator's skill and accuracy directly determined whether a mission's bombs actually struck anything resembling their intended target, or scattered uselessly, and dangerously, across whatever terrain happened to lie beneath the aircraft's flight path at the moment of release. Historians examining the moral and strategic dimensions of the bombing campaign have continued to debate this specific trade-off, decades after the war ended, weighing the argument that radar-guided area bombing represented a necessary and militarily effective response to Japan's persistent bad weather and the strategic imperative to end the war quickly, against the counter-argument that the technology's own inherent targeting limitations made a shift toward broader, less discriminate area bombing, something closer to an inevitable consequence of the tool chosen, rather than purely an independent strategic decision, a debate that intersects directly with the broader historical discussion, addressed in earlier chapters of this channel's coverage of the B-29 campaign, over how directly to connect the incendiary bombing campaign's methods and moral reasoning to the atomic bombings that followed it months later. This trade-off between precision and operational persistence connects directly to a broader and sometimes uncomfortable dimension of the radar-guided night bombing campaign worth acknowledging honestly. Because radar identification of urban targets relied on distinguishing the general radar signature of dense city development from surrounding countryside, rather than pinpointing specific individual military or industrial installations with the same precision a clear visual sighting might theoretically allow. Radar-guided incendiary raids inherently targeted broad urban areas rather than narrowly defined military objectives, a targeting reality entirely consistent with LeMay's deliberate strategic choice to shift toward area incendiary bombing, but one that meant the technology enabling these missions was, by its own basic operating principles, better suited to striking cities as a whole than to the kind of narrowly precise military targeting earlier pre-war bombing doctrine had originally envisioned. For Japanese air defense planners and radio intelligence officers attempting to understand and counter this capability, the challenge was compounded by a basic technical reality that placed Japan at a severe and persistent disadvantage throughout the entire war. Japanese radar research and development, while genuinely present and producing some functional systems, never approached the scale, sophistication, or industrial production capacity of the parallel American and British radar programs, a gap rooted in pre-war research investment, wartime industrial capacity, and the availability of the specific specialized manufacturing capability that high-frequency radar electronics of this era demanded. This meant Japanese engineers, attempting to understand exactly how American bombers were achieving accurate bombing results through cloud cover and darkness, were working from a position of significant technical disadvantage. Without the underlying research base needed to correctly theorize, let alone independently replicate, the specific radar technology American bombers were actually using. There is a specific historical irony worth noting here, because Japan was not entirely without its own radar research and development capability, having produced functional, if generally less sophisticated, radar systems for both air defense detection and, in more limited applications, naval use earlier in the war. The gap that mattered was not a total absence of Japanese radar science, but rather the compounding disadvantage of starting from a smaller pre-war research base, facing severe wartime material shortages, specifically affecting the precision components, high-frequency radar electronics required, and losing increasing amounts of whatever research and manufacturing capacity remained to direct American bombing damage against exactly the kind of industrial facilities capable of producing sophisticated electronics, a self-reinforcing cycle in which American air superiority directly degraded Japan's capacity to develop the technology that might have helped counter that same air superiority. Japanese signals intelligence units did detect and record radar transmissions from approaching American bomber formations, confirming that the aircraft were indeed emitting some kind of active radio signal consistent with radar technology. But converting that detection into an effective countermeasure required a level of technical understanding and rapid engineering response that Japan's strained wartime industrial and scientific establishment struggled to produce at the pace the deteriorating military situation demanded. Japanese physicists and engineers working on these countermeasure programs were not lacking in individual technical talent, and post-war assessments of Japanese wartime scientific personnel generally credit them with genuine understanding of the theoretical principles involved. Once the existence of Allied ground mapping radar became apparent through captured equipment and intelligence analysis later in the war. What Japan's programs consistently lacked was the combination of resources, uninterrupted research time, manufacturing precision capability, and, perhaps most critically, the sheer volume of skilled technical personnel and supporting industrial infrastructure that American and British radar programs could draw upon. A resource gap that no amount of individual scientific talent on the Japanese side could fully overcome, once the war's later years placed Japan's entire industrial and scientific establishment under sustained, escalating bombing pressure. Some Japanese efforts to develop radar jamming or radar detection countermeasures were attempted during the war's final year, but these programs, hampered by the same material shortages, bombing disruption to research and manufacturing facilities, and comparatively limited pre-war investment in radar science that constrained Japanese air defense broadly, never reached a level of deployment or effectiveness capable of meaningfully degrading American radar-guided bombing accuracy before the war's conclusion. Captured American radar equipment, recovered from downed B-29s over the course of the campaign, did provide Japanese engineers with at least some direct physical access to the actual technology involved, and post-war accounts indicate Japanese technical intelligence teams made genuine efforts to study recovered radar components in detail. But converting even a thorough technical understanding of captured equipment into an actual, mass-producible countermeasure or defensive system required exactly the kind of sustained industrial capacity, precision manufacturing, and available skilled labor that Japan's wartime economy, by 1945, could no longer reliably provide, regardless of how clearly Japanese engineers might have come to understand the underlying technology through direct examination of recovered hardware. The practical consequence of this technological gap became starkly apparent through the sustained bombing campaign LeMay's 21st Bomber Command conducted against dozens of Japanese cities through the spring and summer of 1945. Missions flown regularly at night, frequently through cloud cover that would have made purely visual bombing entirely impossible, yet achieving strike accuracy against intended urban and industrial targets that Japanese air defense forces had no reliable way to anticipate, disrupt, or meaningfully counter. Japanese civil defense planning, air raid warning systems, and anti-aircraft deployment all struggled to adapt to a bombing campaign that no longer depended on the predictable patterns of clear weather, daylight raids that had at least allowed some measure of advance warning and defensive preparation based on visible aircraft formations approaching under conditions favorable to conventional interception. Civilian populations in target cities experienced the practical consequence of this defensive gap directly and repeatedly. Air raid warning systems, which had historically provided at least some window of advance notice based on visual or early radar detection of approaching aircraft formations under clearer conditions, became measurably less reliable and less able to provide adequate warning time once night raids conducted through cloud cover became the campaign's standard operating pattern. Since the same weather conditions that concealed American bombers from Japanese visual observation also complicated Japan's own early warning detection efforts, compounding the civil defense challenge at exactly the moment the incendiary campaign's destructive scale made adequate warning time most critical for civilian survival. Surviving accounts from Japanese radar and air defense personnel stationed in target cities during this period describe a persistent and demoralizing sense that American bombing had become, in a specific and unsettling way, almost impossible to predict or prepare for, using the defensive doctrine and technology available to them. Since neither weather nor darkness, the two conditions Japanese defensive planning had always assumed, would provide at least some degree of protective cover, any longer offered meaningful protection against bombing runs guided by a technology Japanese engineers could detect the presence of, but never fully understand or effectively counter. American losses attributable specifically to radar and navigation failures, rather than direct enemy action, represented their own distinct category of risk that mission planners had to account for throughout the campaign. Aircraft occasionally became separated from their formations, or drifted off course during long overwater transit legs, when radar equipment malfunctioned, or when weather conditions exceeded even radar's ability to provide reliable navigational reference, a hazard that added a specific, technology-dependent risk profile to missions that already carried the ordinary dangers of flying deep into contested airspace at night. Crews trained extensively in backup celestial and dead reckoning navigation techniques specifically to provide a fallback capability in the event radar equipment failed mid-mission, a redundancy that reflected how completely the entire night bombing campaign's operational safety, not just its targeting accuracy, had come to depend on this single category of technology functioning reliably under sustained combat conditions. The specific skill and training radar operators developed over the course of the Pacific bombing campaign left a lasting technical and doctrinal legacy that extended well beyond the war's conclusion, establishing foundational techniques in radar-guided navigation and blind bombing that directly informed the development of subsequent American strategic bombing doctrine through the Korean War and into the early Cold War period. a lineage running from the often improvised, hard-won radar interpretation skills developed under wartime pressure against Japan, through to far more sophisticated and reliable radar and eventually satellite-guided navigation and targeting systems that would define American air power for decades afterward. Post-war technical assessments conducted by American intelligence teams examining Japan's wartime scientific and industrial capacity specifically identified the radar technology gap as one of several compounding factors that had left Japan structurally unable to mount an effective defense against the bombing campaign's final and most destructive phase. Findings that fed directly into broader post-war American strategic thinking about the decisive role advanced technology, rather than raw industrial output alone, could play in determining a conflict's outcome. A lesson that shaped American defense research investment and doctrine throughout the early Cold War period that followed. The specific radar operators who flew these missions, working in a role that demanded intense concentration and split-second technical judgment under combat conditions, but that produced none of the individually celebrated public recognition that fighter aces or famous bomber pilots received, remain, in the assessment of many historians studying the technical dimensions of the Pacific Air War, among the more genuinely underappreciated specialists of the entire strategic bombing campaign. There is a final, quieter dimension to this story worth including before closing, because it speaks to how unevenly wartime technical contributions have been remembered in the decades since. The pilots and bombardiers of the strategic bombing campaign against Japan became, in the post-war decades, relatively well-documented figures in popular military history, their missions and individual stories preserved in memoirs, documentaries, and museum exhibits. The radar operators who made the specific tactical shift to night and poor weather bombing operationally possible in the first place received, by comparison, a fraction of that same public attention. Their technical contribution folded largely into the general story of the bombing campaign, rather than recognized as the specific, load-bearing capability without which the campaign's most destructive and strategically consequential phase could not have been conducted at anything approaching the scale it actually achieved. The broader lesson this specific technological gap illustrates about the Pacific War's final year extends well beyond the narrow question of bombing accuracy alone. Japan's inability to correctly diagnose and counter American radar-guided bombing represented one more instance, alongside the proximity fuse, alongside the broader story of Japanese industrial capacity falling further and further behind American wartime research and production, of a widening technical gap that Japan's military and scientific establishment, however individually skilled and dedicated its personnel remained through the war's final desperate months, simply could not close, given the resources, time, and industrial base actually available to it by 1945. Every one of these individual technical gaps, considered on its own, might seem like a narrow, specialized story of interest mainly to historians of military technology. Considered together, across the accumulated weight of dozens of similar American technical advantages compounding through the war's final 2 years, they help explain something much larger. How a war that Japan's own naval planners had once calculated might be winnable in its opening months, had, by 1945, become a conflict Japan's military and industrial establishment no longer possessed the technical capacity to meaningfully contest, regardless of how much individual courage and sacrifice its remaining forces continued to demonstrate on the ground, in the air, and at sea. Remember the question this story opened with: if you cannot see your target at all, how do you still manage to strike it accurately? The answer, as it turned out, required no single dramatic breakthrough, but rather the patient combination of British theoretical science, American industrial scale, and months of grinding, unglamorous training for the specific men whose job was to translate a blurry, ambiguous pattern of light on a small screen into the precise geographic coordinates a bomb release calculation demanded. Working entirely by instrument, in conditions where every other crew member aboard the aircraft could see nothing at all outside the cockpit glass. If you want to understand how American bombers found and struck their targets through weather and darkness that should have made precision bombing impossible, and why Japanese air defense never developed an effective answer to a technology they could detect but never fully understand, this is the story worth knowing in full. Subscribe to Pacific War Tales for more long-form World War II history from the Pacific Theater, told with the names, the dates, and the details intact.